Welcome to Tales on the Couch, where we uncover the dark and shocking tales of relationships that took a tragic turn and cover it in less than 10 minutes. Today's episode is about one of the most notorious cases of a love story gone deadly, Betty Broderick. What began as a seemingly idyllic marriage between two young professionals eventually became a bitter, drawn-out divorce battle filled with betrayal, resentment, and heartbreak. In the end, this story of jealousy and revenge would lead to a double murder, leaving an indelible mark on true crime history. Join the doctor on the couch, and let's explore the life, love, and ultimately, the unraveling of Betty Broderick. The perfect couple, Betty Broderick seemed to have it all: a beautiful home, 4 children, and a husband who was climbing the ranks as a prominent medical malpractice lawyer. Betty and Dan met in college, and from the outside, they looked like the perfect couple. Betty had supported Dan financially and emotionally through his years of medical and law school, believing in his dreams and hoping for a bright future together. In the early years, they shared dreams of building a successful life and raising a family. Betty worked tirelessly to keep their household afloat, often working multiple jobs to support Dan's education. She was the classic 70s and 80s homemaker, pouring her heart into their family life, while Dan seemed to reciprocate her commitment. But as his career took off, cracks began to show in their seemingly picture-perfect marriage. The divorce battle begins. By the 1980s, Dan had become a powerful lawyer in San Diego, and the lifestyle they dreamed of was finally theirs. But as Dan's professional life flourished, Betty began to notice a change in him. In 1983, Betty discovered that Dan had been having an affair with his young, beautiful legal assistant, Linda Kolkina. The discovery shattered her world and sparked what would become one of the most toxic and public divorces of the time. Feeling betrayed, Betty demanded a divorce. But the proceedings were anything but straightforward. Dan, with his legal expertise and influence, seemed to have the upper hand at every turn. He secured custody of the children, froze their assets, and reportedly manipulated the legal system to his advantage. The bitter proceedings left Betty feeling powerless, resentful, and increasingly isolated. Her heartbreak turned into obsession, and she started waging a relentless campaign of harassment and retaliation against Dan and Linda, who eventually became his second wife. Obsession turns to violence. As the years dragged on, Betty's frustration and resentment only intensified. She left countless voicemails filled with anger, vandalized Dan's property, and even drove her car into his front door in a fit of rage. But nothing she did seemed to relieve her feelings of betrayal or gain her the justice she felt she deserved. For Betty, Dan's marriage to Linda was the ultimate insult, a reminder of the life and love she'd lost. In the early hours of November 5, 1989, after years of stewing anger and a sense of betrayal that had reached its breaking point, Betty took matters into her own hands. She entered Dan and Linda's home with a gun, and in a violent outburst shot and killed them both while they were sleeping. The killings shocked the nation and highlighted the extreme consequences of a toxic, bitter divorce. Betty's actions were not only a crime, but the tragic culmination of years of resentment, unhealed wounds, and emotional turmoil. The trial and media frenzy. Betty's trial became a media sensation, with the public fascinated by her story. Some saw Betty as a scorned woman driven to madness by betrayal and injustice. Others viewed her as a cold-blooded killer who refused to let go. Betty took the stand, painting a picture of a woman who had been manipulated, mistreated, and left with nothing after devoting years of her life to Dan's success. Her defense argued that the years of emotional abuse and psychological torment had driven her to an uncontrollable breaking point. The trial captivated the country. People were polarized. Was Betty a victim of a ruthless husband who abandoned her, or was she simply unable to accept that her marriage was over? In the end, the jury convicted her of 2 counts of second-degree murder, and she was sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. Betty Broderick's case continues to spark debate to this day, raising questions about domestic abuse, emotional manipulation, and the psychological toll of divorce. The legacy and lasting impact. Betty Broderick's story lives on, not just as a tale of murder, but as a cautionary tale of how toxic relationships, fueled by betrayal and anger, can push a person to unimaginable places. It reminds us of the emotional devastation that can accompany a bitter divorce, especially when one partner feels betrayed, undervalued, or discarded after years of loyalty and sacrifice. Betty remains in prison, her actions a haunting reminder of how jealousy and heartbreak can sometimes lead to deadly consequences. The Broderick case remains one of the most tragic examples of love turned into obsession and rage. In a way, Betty's story underscores the dangers of leaving wounds unhealed, of unresolved bitterness that can turn destructive. Her legacy is a stark reminder of the thin line between love and hate, a line that once crossed led to an act that changed her life and ended two others forever. Betty Broderick's story is a disturbing, heartbreaking reminder of how complex and painful relationships can sometimes become. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Tales on the Couch. Remember to subscribe and tune in next week for another story where love and crime collide. Until then, stay curious and stay wise.